Hello, good afternoon. It's Tuesday, so let's have a Tuesday talk. Today's topic is, why did I buy a 2012 Mitsubishi i-MiEV electric vehicle as my first EV in 2013? In my last video, you may have seen a tour that I gave of a 2012 Mitsubishi i-MiEV electric vehicle that I recently acquired. And we took a tour and I showed you all around it. And as you could see, it was a pretty small vehicle. And more importantly, in the EV world, it had the smallest battery available of any electric vehicle that was available in my area at the time. And of course, that translates into the shortest range as well. So why did I buy the vehicle with the lowest specs and the worst range at that time? So the i-MiEV only had a 16 kilowatt hour battery. That's 16 kilowatt hours, which by today's standards is really tiny. Even then, it really wasn't that big. The smallest battery I think sold in new EVs now is around 40, with most of them being at least 60 kilowatt hours and above. But at this time, there was really only 3 options available for me to choose between, because we're back in 2013, 2012, the early days of the modern era of electric vehicles. There weren't the dozens of choices available today. So option number 1 was to get the Tesla Model S, because they had just come out with the Model S in 2012. But that vehicle was over $100,000, and while it did have a nice big battery option, you had 3 choices of batteries, 40, 60, and 85. All options were simply really expensive and simply out of my price range, and I wasn't prepared to shell out that much money for any car, regardless of how great it was. Option number 2 was a 2012 Nissan Leaf, which had a 24 kilowatt hour battery, and that one was more in a reasonable price range, but still it was over $40,000, and it was a mid-size to smallish hatchback vehicle. And if you looked at similar gasoline vehicles, they were selling for about half the price or even less. So it was hard to justify spending that much money on a Nissan Leaf. And then the third choice was the 2012 Mitsubishi i-MiEV, which, as you saw in the last video, is really small, and it did come with a slightly smaller price, but the price was still well above $30,000 for a brand new one. And that concludes the list of choices that I have available for me. Now, I had been doing some research and reading and looking at EVs for a couple of years. I was primarily looking for a vehicle that would suit me for my commuting needs, just to get myself back and forth to work. We had a second vehicle in the family at the time, and if we ever needed to do a road trip, we would use that vehicle anyway, so my vehicle was purely needed for commuting only. So I was basically looking for a vehicle that would meet my daily commuting needs back and forth to work. Ultimately, all 3 choices I felt were too expensive, so I kind of just delayed and didn't purchase anything for quite a while. But eventually one vehicle came up, and it was a 2012 i-MiEV, and it was on discount because it had been used as a demonstration model, or the dealer had used it to deliver parts, that sort of thing. So it had only a few thousand kilometers, very few kilometers on it or miles, but it was discounted a fair bit, and that suddenly caught my interest. And I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well do it now, because there's not a lot of vehicles available for choice. And at that time, there was just no vehicles available in the used market at all. So it's either buy a new one or buy nothing. And at that time, I was spending a fair bit of money on fuel. I had a fairly long commute back and forth to work. I was spending somewhere around $250 a month on fuel, which these days actually sounds not too bad, but at the time that felt like a lot of money, and of course it is. So I thought, well, let me see what we can do with this electric vehicle. So I ended up purchasing it. And when I was purchasing it, even the dealer said, you're probably going to put my service department out of business if people keep buying these things. But the reality is they only sold a handful of those anyway. But it allowed me to skip the gas station and just drive directly to work and directly home and recharge at home. One of the first things I did after I purchased the vehicle is installed a level 2 AC charger in my garage at home. And I did that myself. I just bought one on Amazon, which today is easy to do. There's lots and lots. There's dozens of choices of chargers or EVSEs available on Amazon. But at that time, I think I only found 1 or maybe 2 choices. And the one I bought was a Bosch charger, and it only had a single review, Amazon review on it. There was only 1 review on it because I guess they'd maybe only sold 1 or 5 or something like that. But I purchased that and installed it myself, and it even works still today. All these years later, after thousands of charge cycles through various vehicles I've had, it continues to work and was a great addition to my EV experience. Essentially, as soon as I got home from work every day, I would just simply plug it in, and I knew by the morning it would be fully charged and ready to go. In my first year of ownership, I put about 27,000 kilometers or about 17,000 miles on it. And I was definitely saving a lot of money on fuel costs. I suppose another option that you might say is, well, why did you spend all that money on a car? You could have just moved closer to work and then you'd save money on fuel anyway and save time and everything else. But it happens to be that where I'm located, if I moved closer to my workplace, I would be further from my wife's workplace, and so she'd have to drive further. So that didn't seem to work out. Option two would be to just get a job closer to home, and that also didn't suit me as an option. I wasn't interested to do that. So option number three was to purchase a vehicle that was very fuel efficient, and in this case, it was the electric vehicle. Over the time I've owned it, it proved to be quite reliable and very functional for what I needed it to do. It didn't put up a fuss or any trouble. It just would go, and where I pointed it, it would provide me with reliable transportation commuting back and forth to work. I continued to drive that vehicle for about 5 or 6 years, and at that point I had around 120,000 to 130,000, around 80,000 kilometers on it. That's around 80,000 miles. And I did eventually find a used Nissan Leaf, and I purchased that as well. And so I was then primarily using the Nissan Leaf. Now, it felt like a huge upgrade when I moved to the Nissan Leaf because it has a much larger battery. It has a 24 kilowatt hour battery, so it's 50% larger. And it just felt like I had millions of miles of range available to me when I bought the battery, I bought the car with the larger battery. But the reality is the Nissan Leaf, still only has a 24 kilowatt hour battery, which by today's standards is still tiny. And even though it had a 50% larger battery, the Nissan isn't quite as efficient in using the electricity as the i-MiEV is, simply because the Leaf is a little bit heavier vehicle. It's not a heavy vehicle, but it is physically larger and bulkier than the i-MiEV, the Mitsubishi, so it only gained me about a 30% increase in range, but still at that time that felt like I could drive it forever without having to recharge, so it was quite an upgrade for me. I hadn't intended to sell my Mitsubishi. I was hanging on to it and using it in the family as a second EV, but someone approached me and asked me if it was for sale, and we agreed on a price, and she really seemed to like it. She described it as cute, and I thought, well, let's pass it along to someone else, and they'll have enjoyment out of it. And as far as I know, she's continuing to drive it, and she was going to be using it for the same purpose as me, just as your commuter back and forth to work. So over the time I owned the vehicle, it did certainly save me a lot of money on fuel. I'm going to say thousands of dollars. I'm sure it was over $10,000 of fuel costs during the time I've owned it. And so it proved to be very suitable for the purpose I bought it for. Now, I had switched from a kind of a mid-size car. I was previously driving a Toyota, and it had cruise control, and it was a little bit softer suspension and a little bit of a bigger car. So it was a little bit of a change to get used to the smaller vehicle. I do portion of my commute on the highway and portion in the city. I drive into a city. So it was a little bit less comfortable on the highway, a little bit less smooth. The suspension isn't quite as good as the larger Toyota was, but it still was serving its needs. And because I was saving so much money on fuel, I was grinning ear to ear driving it. And even on the highway, even with a small vehicle like that, it was able to keep up with traffic quite handily. The EVs have quite a bit of pep, quite a bit of power, so certainly power was not an issue and speed was not an issue. It kept up pretty well and suited its purpose very nicely. Overall, it was very easy to adapt to this vehicle. The one little feature I was kind of missing on it was cruise control. I do have a section of highway driving, as I mentioned, and it didn't have the cruise control feature, so I did miss that, but it was fine. I mean, it was just like driving an older vehicle. It didn't have that option, so that was fine. Also, the car itself doesn't have an extremely large number of options. It's not got a lot of features on it. It's kind of like driving a car from the 90s. It's more simple. It just has a radio, and it just has, you know, your fan speed and your heater on and off sort of thing. There's no modern features like Bluetooth or Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, anything like that. But that's fine. I was around in the 90s, and maybe you were too. And I'm sure you remember that time there wasn't all those fancy features, and that was fine for me. I didn't need all that. Really, it was just a commuter car for me to get back and forth to work. And the other thing is the vehicle itself is small on the outside, but the interior is actually fairly good size. I'm 6'1" or about 185 centimeters tall, and I have plenty of headroom in that vehicle. When someone would get into the car with me, which wasn't very much, I was mostly commuting by myself, but when someone got in, they were sitting quite close to me in the driver's seat. We're almost shoulder to shoulder, so they would comment on the smallness of it, but overall it was quite functional for what I was using it for, and that commuting purpose was exactly what I needed. The other thing this vehicle gave me was confidence in electric vehicles. I was kind of an early adopter, trying to figure out electric vehicles, seeing if they would work. At the time, there was very little experience people had with them, and so there was a lot of questions about how long do they last, what's the reliability. And now looking at this one that we looked at in the last video that's already 12 years old and it's still fully functional, we can see that they're quite reliable and robust for the long term. And me driving that vehicle for that many thousands, tens of thousands of kilometers and miles allowed me to gain confidence in the vehicles, and allowed me to have the opportunity to test them out thoroughly and gain confidence that they were a suitable option for the purpose I was using it for. Even today, even though I don't have that vehicle anymore, I still enjoy passing by the gas pump and just going straight home and plugging in my car. It's definitely lots of fun to do that, and I don't miss the combustion vehicle at all. So if you're watching this video and you're thinking of buying an electric vehicle, hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you owned an i-MiEV and that's why you clicked on this video, I'm curious to hear your story. How long did you own your i-MiEV, or do you still have it? And how many kilometers or miles do you have on it? And what have you used it for? There's not a lot of them out there, but there were thousands of them built, and they were sold all over the world. Primarily, I believe, in North America, Europe, and Japan were the main markets for them. As far as I know, they stopped selling them in 2017, and the technology has simply moved on now. You know, you can get a lot better car, a lot bigger battery, a lot longer range, a lot more features for the same price they were charging for that one over 10 years ago. But that's the good thing about technology, is it improves and it changes, and those early vehicles were ways for the early adopters and for the manufacturers to learn about the technology as they were adapting and changing and inventing and designing their new cars. So overall, I think it was a good choice for me to purchase the vehicle. It fit my needs for what I intended to do with it, and it ended up being a great money saver in terms of fuel costs. And then, of course, if you drive an EV, you know that there's almost no maintenance. I'm not sure if I ever did any maintenance on this vehicle. There's really nothing to do on it. I did have to get a set of tires on it. I did buy a set of winter tires as well, but overall there was no regular routine oil changes and spark plugs and timing belts and all those things that had to be done. Just this, you know, completely maintenance free basically. So let me know in the comments if you think I made the right decision purchasing this tiny little electric vehicle back in 2013. I know a lot of people were hoping I didn't choose that one, and in a previous video I had given you 3 options and said, hey, which one do you think I chose? A lot of people said the Nissan Leaf, which is the logical choice if you purely base it on cost and features. But in my case, I was trying to go for the cheapest vehicle, and then when I found this particular one on discount, it turned out to be the choice for me at the time. The great news is if you spend any moderate amount of money now on a used electric vehicle, you can get a vehicle that is far superior to that one that I bought just 11 years ago. There's so many options out there, so many in the used market, so many in the new market. There's really hundreds of choices available. The times have changed significantly, and I imagine the next 10 years we'll see a similar amount of change as well. So thanks for watching the video today. If you found it interesting or informative, I'd appreciate it if you would give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing for future videos. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.